want to talk a little bit about that. I am not a Russia expert at all. My only connections to Russia are my grandmother was from Russia. And I was the first chair of the Maryland Leningrad Oblast Sister State Committee. And that's it. So now we're going to go to Russia experts. The first question I have, I'm going to ask all the questions, but then we're going to go to the floor pretty quickly. So my question is, during the Cold War, the United States had a strategy in dealing with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union collapses. We then had a strategy for about, say, 7 or 8 years, basically the Clinton administration, which I served. We had a strategy which was, we'll be able to integrate integrate Russia into the West, democracy, free market, all that kind of stuff. That didn't work out so well, but it was a strategy. And I know the strategy because I was serving that administration. My Romanian friends all said, you are so naive. And they turned out to be right. Since the beginning of this century, I want to ask our panelists, what has been our strategy? It's not obvious to me that we've had a strategy, but perhaps you know about strategy that I don't know about, or if there isn't one, why hasn't there been one? Go first, Don.
Well, you gave it 4 minutes. I'll try to keep.
No more than 4 minutes.
I would say, first of all, I would look at 2 things in explaining this lack of strategy. That's what it is. Do you hear me okay?
Yeah.
A couple of things. Number one, I think that let's look at Russia. We essentially, in my view, and it's controversial, misread what happened in '91. It was not a democratic breakthrough. It could have been, but it was not. It was a collapse of the Soviet Union. I agree with that. And Russia could have proceeded in a number of ways toward democracy or not, or zigzagging, whatever it is, but it didn't work. So I think the U.S. in '91, and I helped write a lot of the cables from the embassy, we misread what happened. We assumed this would be like Poland or China, Poland or Czech Republic. And when I would talk to some of the shock therapists, they would say, well, it worked in Poland, it will work here. And it didn't. So we misread Russia. Number 2, what happened at the beginning of the late '90s as a result of misreading Russia and internal developments is that Russia went off the rails or went back toward its more traditional imperial worldview, strategic culture, I would call it. And that accelerated under Putin for a variety of reasons we can talk about. Third, the rise of Vladimir Putin, and I would call the KGB state, promotes as an ideology and as a worldview a set of assumptions and patterns of behavior which reinforce its differentness from the United States, sees the U.S. and the West as the enemy. You know all about this. So things happen inside of Russia, which either we misread or created bad policies to address or whatever. We can talk more about that. On our side, you asked the strategy, let me answer it again in a more complicated way. In '89, '90, and '91, we explicitly thought Russia would transition to the global international space, global law-based international system. That didn't happen, but we expected that it would have. And that's not just Bush or Clinton or Bush 2 or Obama or Biden or Trump, or I would not include Trump. So we expected a way of behavior, a transition toward an ideal future, which we expected to happen and tried to encourage. And that gave us a strategy to address that goal of a democratic, prosperous Russia. And it did work. And I think, frankly, we're still paying the price for this misreading, for this ill-advised policy. A friend of mine, and will stop, Paul Goebel, you may know, and I, in my classes at Hopkins, always say 3 things. Americans think that for every problem, there is a solution. Americans think that history doesn't matter, unless you're San Francisco looking at Los Angeles. And Americans tend to think, not everybody tend to think that culture doesn't matter. And I would add a final one, which is that if we think there's no solution, there must be no problem. And this colors the way I think that we see the U.S. foreign policy. Not everybody, but it's a tendency to have bad consequences. I'm partly guilty of it because I wrote a lot of the cables in the '90s. But this causes a challenge to get back to what you said, which is what strategy should we have?
We'll come back to that. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Ian?
That's a big question. Look, in the 1990s, we were driven by the optimism of the end of the Cold War era. And Don said, we were driven by the objective of figuring out how we could integrate Russia into a wider Europe. Not necessarily as a member of NATO or a member of the EU, but as a constructive partner in a Europe that was coal-free and secure. That objective shaped all our policies to slow down the possible pace of NATO expansion, NATO enlargement. It shaped our relationship with Ukraine. And then you had during the Bush administration the shock of 9/11. And with that shock came the hope that we could actually partner with Russia in the war against terrorism. Remember, Bush looked into Putin's eyes and saw hope in that regard, saw a soul, so to speak. So that was a continuation. Then you had the dissolution that came in 2008 with the invasion of Georgia. And then the next administration came in and said, well, you know, optimistically, let's have our first reset of that. Yet hoping that, blaming the Bush administration for mismanaging the relationship, mismanaging world politics, blaming essentially ourselves for the direction that Russia was going. So we pursued a reset in that regard. We've had 2 or 3 resets in that regard, always hoping that Russia would somehow lurch back onto a path of democratic reform, of becoming a constructive international partner. And I would say is that hope has precluded us from using the full force of transatlantic power, U.S. leadership, economic might, military force, because we've always been afraid of pushing Russia in the wrong direction, which then, of course, reinforced Putin's ambitions, his confidence he could pursue his efforts, successfully pursue his efforts to reconstitute the space of the former Soviet Union. We hesitated, always afraid of either pushing in the wrong direction or falling into the dangers of an escalatory relationship. So we've been in a reactive posture, and that's been our fault over these last three decades.
Push up.
Thank you very much once again for inviting me, and it's quite really ironic that I'm here today because I'm the least diplomatic person you can have on a panel. So let's be the state. Whether we like it or not, back during the Cold War, we understood that we were at war with Russia. Today, nobody wants to acknowledge that. And if you read carefully Putin's statements and other Russian government officials, they do believe that they're already at war with the West. So what was wrong and what was good back then? The number one thing is I couldn't agree more with Don when he emphasized the role of culture and the role of understanding, because the world does not revolve around Brussels and Washington, and our adversaries are oftentimes not thinking like us. So back then, I do believe that we understood very, very well old Russian joke, which is that there was a peasant and he was surrounded by 2 houses, and both houses and his neighbors had cows. And he was very sad that he didn't have one. So he actually was praying to God for help. So God asked him, do you want me to give you a cow? And he said, no, I want you to kill the cows of my neighbors. So this really perfectly summarizes how the Kremlin thinks versus how we like to think. We love to think about win-win strategy. Putin loves to think either win-lose or lose-lose strategy. So until we understand that, we are really doomed to fail. The second thing is, Putin openly stated that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And having said that, he's in a revenge path. He wants to rewrite the global order. Whether he's going to succeed or not, it's up for a debate. But that is his ultimate goal, because the war in Ukraine, it's not only about Ukraine. It's truly about rewriting a global order. And I'm more than happy later to discuss more what he really wants. But there is another thing, we were very, very good during the Cold War. Reagan understood that perception matters, and who has information superiority wins wars. One of the greatest American weapons is not tomahawk, it's not attackers, it's truly democracy, ideology, and our values. And back during the Cold War, as my family grew up in Eastern Europe, they loved American modern art. They loved American jazz music. And there are now plenty of declassified documents that you can read. How Washington was leveraging American art to win hearts and minds. We have been abandoning that tool for a very long time. And I think it's really past time to bring back with the modern technology. I doubt, in highly nationalistic societies that young Russians or, for example, young people in China care about Taylor Swift. But there are other areas and venues where we can actually use information to alter perception. So I'm going to stop here.
Thank you very, very much. Well, I'm really depressed. So now we're gonna go to the optimistic part of the discussion, which is what should we do now? And I'm gonna go a little different. I'm gonna start with Ian. If our strategy for the past 20 years, I'm gonna say 20 years plus or minus, has not been terrific, what should our strategy be going forward, vis-a-vis Russia?
When you think of strategy, you got to think about, one, what's the reality you're in? What are some of the enduring realities that shape Russia's role in international affairs? You then want to also then define for yourself some clear objectives from which you build a strategy, and then you have your actions for your implementing strategy. I would say among the more important realities we have to recognize is something that Ivana did. Russia is not just a war against Ukraine. It's a war against NATO, and we have to recognize that. Ukraine is probably Putin's primary objective. That's the most important territory. He needs to acquire to reconstitute that space of the former Soviet Union, or his definition of rightful Russian lands. And towards that end, he needs to defeat NATO. Because if he weakens NATO or defeats NATO, it makes Ukraine that much more achievable. So one, Russia is a war against Ukraine. Second, this is a long-term challenge. Putin's going to be around probably for a long term, we assume that. And even if he disappears for some reason, he's created a structure, a polity, a new generation of leaders that are going to pursue his objectives. So this is a long-term problem. Three, we've got to recognize that Russia's capabilities are not decreasing, they're increasing. His economy continues to plow on in the face of our current posture towards Russia. His armed forces are getting larger, not smaller. His army today is larger than when it invaded Ukraine in the second phase of the war in 2022. And he continues to modernize his nuclear arsenal, his naval arsenal, his air force. He's becoming a more capable adversary. The good news is the fourth reality, is that still today, despite the growth of Russian military power and its aggressiveness, we have massive overmatch over Russia. The West transcontinental is massive overmatch in front, economically, militarily, ideologically, and such. So what do you want to do? What do you want to achieve in your strategy? I call it the DDCD. You want to defeat Russia and Ukraine first and foremost, because that's the alligator that's closest to the canoe, so to speak. And if he wins in Ukraine, you're going to have a deeper problem in Europe. You're going to risk the collapsing the transatlantic community, and he's going to be spurring aggression elsewhere in the world, particularly I watch China in this regard. So defeat Ukraine is your first primary objective. Second, you need to ensure you're effectively deterring Putin from aggression against the transatlantic community, against NATO and its partners. We're clearly not doing the job today. Look what happened in Poland just a couple of weeks ago with 22 drones, constant air incursions in the Baltic and the Black Sea. We've had assassination, we've had sabotage. The list goes on. We're not being effective in deterrent. We have to increase that deterrence against Russia. The third objective is to contain Russian influence beyond its borders. So he's not pulling partners like Iran and China and others against us. And then finally, the D, final D, third D, so to speak, is we need to have a strategy that degrades Russia's capability to exercise aggression and its will to do so. And what are things you need to do with that? Well, just look at the case of Ukraine. It's levering up our overmatch. It's leveraging our $55 trillion in GDP we have in NATO alone against Russia's $2. Massive economic steps to shut down his war machine. We can do that. We haven't exercised that. It means providing security assistance to Ukraine. We could do more. We can release more authorities for the use of the weapons. It means reinforcing our own defenses. NATO has these wonderful new plans to defend its frontier. We haven't resourced those plans yet. It means leveraging our information, our ideological advantages. Are we really supporting any Russian opposition today? Are we weaponizing the power of truth? No, in fact, we've kneecapped ourselves by shutting down our information operations. USIA way back in the 1990s. RFE, RE all weekend. Voice of America almost shut off completely. We should be weaponizing the power of truth to stimulate opposition within Russia's own backyard, to keep force to look inward. These are some of the action items you have underway to accomplish your goal: defeating Russia and Ukraine, deterring more effectively against its aggression against us, containing its influence, and degrading its power and will exercise that aggression.
Thank you. Now I want to move back to Ivana. You touched on art as part of the strategy. Why don't you move on to other pieces of the strategy that you think we should do going forward?
Not to repeat everything that you said, but this is exactly, I couldn't agree more with every statement that you emphasized, but I would like to add a few maybe more things. Number one, I think it's really past time to put Putin on a pedestal, that he is a great leader and that he is such a strong man, because let's call a spade a spade. He was a second-rate KGB guy during the Cold War. And having said that, he understands very well how to leverage and how to weaponize fear in the West, including threats related to nuclear weapons. If you read carefully Russian national security strategy and their nuclear doctrine, you will understand very well that for Russia, nuclear weapons are actually cognitive weapons. So that's number one, Peter. We have to remove that from the negotiation table when it comes to spreading fears. The second thing is, we also have to acknowledge that Russia is operating based on something what I call a new generation of warfare, which includes not only military efforts, something we see in Ukraine, but also non-military efforts, something what you were explaining about sabotage activities, cutting cables, drone incursions, etc., because indeed, Russia's ultimate goal is truly to show that NATO is a paper tiger. So, but here is also the ugly truth. Russia has its own, what I like to call mini NATO, CSTO, and that CSTO is actually falling apart. I apologize, but where was the West spreading the truth about Russian lies when it comes to the CSTO? Russia didn't help Armenia when there was a war with Azerbaijan. Armenia is not happy with the CSTO. Moreover, where is Russia now to help its other allies? So the third thing is, I do believe that there is a very important Russian doctrine, which is called reflexive control, which means basically how you feed your opponent with information that he or she believes benefit him or her, but actually benefits you. And it's maybe really past time to also turn the script when it comes to our military and to take advantage of what we call a very similar thing, which is perception management, and to strengthen perception management against our adversaries. And the fourth point that I also want to make, Russia also has numerous weaknesses. For example, oftentimes I hear people in the West discussing BRICS as a financial institution that is not important. Yes, it is some sort of a financial institution, but that's not the point of BRICS. BRICS serves for Russia as a perception organization to rally their allies in the global south. And Russia has multiple problems in the global south that we should use as a leverage. And I only have a few minutes, so I don't want to dive into all those problems, but I'm more than happy to discuss it later. And actually, there is one more thing. Russia does not see the current global circumstances as a new Cold War 2.0, as we like to see it. Russia actually calls this current confrontation as the Great Game, the one, back all the way back, in the Caucasus. So they have lots of problems over there. So to conclude, what to do? We have to actually never mistake kindness for weakness, and there is only one thing that Putin understands, which is the language of power.
Thank you. Don?
Well, my two friends have articulate points, but let me add here.
Get folks here, Don, or you need my.
I'm sorry.
Microphone.
The microphone is, yes.
Should know. To add to what Ivana and Ian said, I think we ought to know much better about Russia's the leadership, how they behave, what they're after, for example, when they try to negotiate about a strategic arms treaty, which I worked on, or with Trump or with Biden. And if you look at it carefully, I think you will see a significant amount of differences in how they approach some things such as negotiating on a particular issue. The Russians don't want win-win, I'm okay, you're okay. They want them to win, themselves to win, and us to lose, or we both lose. They want to make sure that we lose more than they do. It's a very different way of looking at about how to relate to the other country. If you see a friend of mine, Radek Sikorski, who's the Prime Minister of Poland, wrote a very interesting article in the New York Times, I think on Friday, talking about the need to be tough with the Russians. We need to be tough with the Russians. And I don't think either Biden or the current administration capture that enough in an effective way to get to whatever deal we want to have. I go back to Ian's excellent points with how we want to relate to this country, because we make a lot of assumptions that are not really based on how they behave. You can look at Medvedev, who threatens nuclear war every day or two. You can look at Putin. There are very clear patterns of behavior, which is not what we would expect if we're negotiating a business deal or the Biden team taking a different approach. We have to be very, very careful not to mirror image how we behave in this kind of situation. Ian mentioned RFP, and you mentioned the younger generation earlier, and I think we have to be careful not to assume that the younger generation is necessarily going to be more peaceful, more benign, more whatever, or more friendly to the United States. There's very little evidence to support that, and that suggests that while they may change, and I certainly believe in RFP's role, they may not change as well. We have to focus less on Putin, but on the society, changing kind of the assumptions under which they operate. It's a big challenge. Just this morning, the Kremlin put Vladimir, we all know, on a terrorist list. Khodorkovsky, the businessman, we all know, on the terrorist list. So they are tightening the screws, and there's really no public, there's opposition clearly, but there's not the kind of opposition as we saw under Solidarity in the 80s, or in the 90s, or in all that. So we have to be very, very careful about the assumptions on which we build the strategy. On that, I very much agree with Ian.
Great, thank you very much. I feel better now. Thank you all for very, very thoughtful comments. We're going to open it up to the floor. Who wants to go first? Yes, Ambassador Hughes.
Okay, microphone's right. Oh. Oh, there it is. Thank you. I want to pick up on something that Ian Brzezinksi said a bit ago about Putin's regime and a generation or other leaders, structures, successor potentials that lie behind him now. A number of years ago, when Fiona Hill did her first edition of Mr. Putin, and actually lectured here about it, what I remember her saying then, but that was then, is that if Putin disappeared from this regime, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that there would be any path to democracy or anything like that, but neither would it be the same regime, because he had put together a particular and idiosyncratic sort of mosaic of different people, oligarchs, interests, leaders of particular institutions to control the society his way. But a successor wouldn't necessarily be able to step into those shoes and manipulate the same set of strings and levers. He'd have to put his own, he or she, put his own stamp on things and configure his own leadership succession. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, Vladimir Karamazov, who's now here, as I understand it, interesting to put him on a terror list when he's here, but that means, but he continues to write optimistically about Russia will have a democratic future, if at least they don't blow it the next time there is an opportunity to do it. The next time there's a leadership vacuum or something that would enable that. And you offer sort of a third view, which is actually there might be remarkable continuity of the Putin regime if he suddenly died or had an accident or something.
And the question is,
what do we really think will happen?
please, go first.
Good question.
What do we think is going to happen?
Three different models. What do we really think will happen?
Well, there are
Yeah.
a number of scenarios. I'm getting over a Bronco phase. It's not age, it's mileage included. A lot too much time in Russia. I think that after Putin leaves, certainly many of these things we see are Putin's personal leadership. There's a lot of, if you read obsessively as I do the Russian hard right commentaries, there's a lot of dissatisfaction that Putin isn't going far enough. But also, Putin makes a lot of these decisions sort of in an increasing isolation, and it's a very troubling thing because he's not. There are not a lot of working groups in the Kremlin to tell Putin what to do, and that's very, very troubling. I would expect continuing authoritarian system, perhaps not as extreme. Perhaps they may even cut a deal on the war. I don't think Putin will, but I expect a continually authoritarian regime, one that sees the West as an enemy, one that defines itself in opposition to the Western democracies. And this makes Ukraine even more valuable for them to victory. So actually, I would expect that to happen. You see there's a great article by a former KGB general named Sebastianov earlier this year, published in a think tank in Washington, where he talks about strains in the society. And they are clearly there. We don't talk about them enough, between the center and the region, between the big businessmen, some of whom want to come and cut a deal with Washington and the KGB, between the military and the KGB, and other kinds of ways too. There are strains in the society, as Ian said. We have more resources than they do. You can see the strains every day. But I think for now, we can't comment on anything snapping. I was there in '91 during the coup, and we spent, trust me, 2 or 3 years before then, talking about how the USSR would reform and become a more democratic system. There's a lot of things going on that's hard to pinpoint, but there are a lot of things going on that suggest both a continued authoritarianism, but also internal stress on the system. What does that mean? It means it could be an evolutionary change, like happened in '64, or it could be something that snaps, as we thought with Prigozhin 3 years ago. A black swan is always a possibility. I don't think, as my Columbia professor used to say, an abrupt discontinuity should never rule out with Putin, because it is a brittle system, more brittle probably than you give it credit for, but still going in a repressive, authoritarian way, partly because it is sobering.
I'm depressed again. Ian?
I think you can be optimistic about Russia in the long run and concerned in the near term. So if you look beyond Putin, I think in the near term, I'm worried because I don't see a very robust opposition. I see a society that is closed off from the rest of the world. I see those who have the most kind of liberal tendencies being decimated, imprisoned, killed. I see him nurturing an ugly form of nationalism, particularly among the youth. So, I actually am worried that Putin were to go, that he could actually be replaced by somebody who's far worse, far more unpredictable, far more emotional, far more spasmodic, so to speak. Putin is actually a pretty cool cucumber. He's very methodical. He's got clear objectives. He goes, he'll retreat. If he feels he's being pushed back, he did that in Georgia. He did that after he blew up a Russian battalion in Syria. He knows when to stop. So he's actually a very modulated fellow. I worry that a replacement to Putin in the near term could be far more unpredictable, far more
Mercurial.
far more dangerous as a result, far less manageable as a result. And as for the long-term prospects, when you have a society that has been dominated for 25 years by an authoritarian who's systematically trying to root out all liberal elements of that society, you can't expect it all of a sudden to become a thriving democracy, on the turn of a dime. Particularly when we have actually cut back our assistance to those elements. We have cut back our efforts to engage society. That's the big mistake of our current policy right now. We're not engaging the Russian people. We're not informing them of the opportunities that are out there. We're not trying to educate them in alternative approaches. We're actually enabling, through our passivity, Putin's ability to shape the future of the country. But if we reanimate those efforts that were a key element of our strategy and our effective strategy during the Cold War, I think the prospects for Russia evolving to democracy are pretty good. It just won't be instantaneous. Thank you, Ivana.
Sorry, but I will make you depressed again. I actually don't think that Russia is going to become democracy anytime soon. As a matter of fact, a friend of mine, Ian Gardner, wrote a fascinating book called Generation Z, where he described how Russia has been weaponizing nationalism, specifically targeting the youth over there. And if you see young kids, for example, in kindergarten wearing Z t-shirts and talking about military and having all those different military camps, that really tells you all you need to know, that the future is not going to be bright, even if we go back to the Cold War era and use our modern art or Taylor Swift to try to win their hearts and minds. The second thing is, yes, during the Cold War in the Soviet Union, there was also an huge economic problem. So of course, they're watching American economy booming and how they live. That was very appealing. But nowadays, it's not going to actually alter the behavior of young people over there, because they can still travel to the West and to enjoy all the benefits from the West, including on social media, yet, at the same time, enjoy Russian imperialistic ideology. And my last point to that is, the sooner we understand that Russia is not going to become democracy anytime soon, the better for us, because that really also helps us to figure out our strategy, what you referred.
Thank you, Don. Go ahead.
If I add a footnote here on the current, I agree with you, in the long term, it could well be a more pluralist country. I think it's very important at the moment to watch how the Russians engage with the U.S. and the West. They had a certain pattern of behavior with Biden, and now it's changed significantly, partly to get the Trump administration away from the Europeans. You see the inclusion all of a sudden of economic business ties on the agenda. Putin in February had Kirill Dmitriev, former KGB guy, who's the bag man for Putin. So they realized that the Trump administration's approach is different than Biden's, and one could agree or disagree with either administration. But they paid a great deal of attention to that. And you'll see, I know you have better things to do, but track all of Oral's comments, for example, or Medvedev's, is very geared toward a very close reading of what goes on in the United States. They often make mistakes, and that's our favorite, but it's really worth paying attention to because Putin knows that the Trump administration may, I didn't say are, but may be more accommodationist on some issues than Biden was. They know that Biden has a certain approach. They pay a very close attention to that, and it forms their tactic and strategy on a given month, a given summit, whatever you might say. But it's worth paying attention to because you can see how they're working. They're not the most subtle people in the world, unlike maybe the Chinese. You can see how they're approaching these problems. It's worth paying attention to get a reading of what's the temperature, what's going on in the relationship, bad or worse or improving. And again, it's very instructive.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Sedgwick.
Ivana, there's been a lot of controversy about the extent to which the Russians have interfered with our election. So could you tell us, you're a real expert in this area, could you tell us a little bit about your perspective, what they've been able to do or have done in the past and what their capabilities are and how active they are now? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, there have been numerous reports on Russian election interference. So this is really nothing new. But I think it's very important to understand, to zoom out and to see the big picture, because it's not only about election interference. The Russian goal are not specifically to elect one person over the other, but truly to polarize our society. And that polarization is not every 2 years, whether we are talking about elections or elections. It's actually 24/7 over different issues. I always like to use the most benign examples, such as, let's say, California secession, trying to weaponize secession in California. But it's not only that, it's also in terms of our socioeconomic issues. It's also when it comes to different social issues. When it comes to, of course, the war in Ukraine, whether, or what you just mentioned, peace through trade. So there are so many different areas where Russia has been trying to polarize the society. And what I like to also emphasize, this is not some hodgepodge on social media. There is a strategy over there, and Russia has been adapting their influence operations. So it's not only more about bots and trolls that we can easily detect and expose. They're, for example, working very hard to build better relations with social media influencers, especially young social media influencers, to spread certain narratives, because then it looks like a grassroots movement. And the third point is, with the AI, it's becoming more and more difficult really to detect. So even for me, who have been following this before, it was cool to talk about influence operations. I even nowadays fall into their traps sometimes where I cannot detect whether this is AI or not. So we are really not in a good state, especially as we mentioned that we have abandoned numerous tools when it comes to social media, when it comes to influence operations. I think exposing those influence operations, it's very important, but even more importantly, I think it's really past time for us to go on the offensive and to put Russia on the defensive so they can spend time, energy, and resources defending themselves. And as someone who relatively new in DC, maybe this is too idealistic what I'm going to say, but to do that, it requires only one thing. We have the best capabilities, we have the best technology, we have the best experts. But there is one thing, which is risk aversion, which is awarded in Washington, DC. And to conduct such influence operations, we need to be more risk tolerant.
Thank you. Either you gentlemen, if they come to this question. Okay, next question, please.
Sharon Mueller of American University. Could you comment on your observations of the Trump-Putin relationship and their respective goals?
Who wants to go first? Putin and Trump, their relationship. What do you think?
I nominate Ian for that. I think we all have views on that.
Putin has clear objectives. His objectives are to, reestablish Moscow's role as a dominant global power. With that, he has clear territorial objectives. that is to reconstitute Canada of the former Soviet states. Ukraine, of course, being the most important dimension to that. Is in favor of who was the next on this list. And central to accomplishing these goals is to eliminate Russia's biggest nemesis in his eyes, which of course is the transatlantic relationship and its institutions, NATO and American leadership. That's his goals. That's how he approaches Trump. Trump approaches Russia with the following kind of, I'd say, assumptions governing his approach. One is that he doesn't see the United States as having vital interests in Europe, interests worth fighting for. You know, he may not dispute whether or not we had vital interests worth fighting for in World War II or during the Cold War, but today he doesn't see it there, and that shapes his whole approach to Euro-Atlantic security, including Russia. With Russia, he is still animated by the prospects of his own form of a reset. He wouldn't call it that because it's the tarnished term, but he sees economic opportunities between the United States and Russia, critical minerals, energy and such. Just 6 months ago, he was still flirting with the idea of reanimating Nord Stream 2 as a joint U.S. Russian project with a family dimension to it. So he sees economic opportunity for there. He's dismissive of the European leadership. Seems weak, facile, unwilling to fight for their own interests, exploitative of U.S. largesse. But economic opportunity with Russia, he's impressed by Putin's command of power. That's what drives his approach to Putin. I think we're beginning to see some signs of disillusion with that. I don't think his disillusion has firmly set in. You can see it in the way he's changing approach over the last several weeks toward Ukraine, showed us there's new thinking going on there. And it could be new thinking that's been elevated by his perceived success in the Middle East, where he has leveraged American power to force ceasefire in Gaza. That exercise of power maybe it make him a little bit more comfortable exercising that in his approach to ending the fighting between Russia and Ukraine and Russia's invasion, right? So I start off with a very negative view of Trump's approach to Putin, but the last weeks make me say, well, you know, there may be some change, but still to be confirmed.
Thank you, Ivana. You have a comment on this?
I think that peace through trade never worked and it will not work this time either. I think President Trump has been trying to give Putin numerous opportunities to negotiate. And when there was a red carpet that he allowed Putin to walk in, it has been very much criticized here. But I also want to remind people, also President Trump put B-2 jets above Putin's head, which was also to send a signal, yes, I am going to allow you to walk on this red carpet, but peace through trade is up above your head. So I think it's too early really to discuss what President Trump will do. I think that his strategy is to what I like to call to pollute the information space in terms of not being clear with his strategy, which is something that really Putin fears and hates. So he has announced that his next goal today actually is to end war in Ukraine. I think there are numerous ways that President Trump can do it. Number one, to target Russian center of gravity, which is economy and energy. And number two, to send all the weapons that Ukraine needs to put Russia on the defensive. The good news is that for many years, Putin has been trying to, as I mentioned, to weaponize that fear about nuclear escalation. And President Trump actually moved and announced to move nuclear submarines and to actually, he made a very hilarious social media post calling Medvedev like a former unsuccessful president. So those types of messaging are very, very good. I think we still have opportunity, we still have time, and we still have capabilities to defeat Russia. And I truly hope that in the coming weeks, that President Trump will impose peace through strength, but we'll see.
God,
I got it right. Did I know?
I think so.
I have no idea what their personal relationship is, however, I will very much agree with what Ivana and Ian said. I think that Putin's has a transactional, one might say cynical, view of international politics. And Trump is also often described as transactional, and I think that that overlaps to some extent, and they see the world just to some extent in a similar way, which maybe on either side allows them to think that they could do business together. I very much agree with Ian that Trump is clearly tilting away from his earlier positions, and I think that the Russians know that, even though in the rhetoric of all Putin, they always talk about the U.S. differently than the Europeans, because they see the European, the United States as someone they could probably do business with, or is more likely a partner than the Europeans are at the moment. But I want to get back to the original point, which is to say that the Russians pay a great deal of attention to American domestic politics. They know about the MAGA base, and so-called. They pay attention to it, but more importantly, they pay attention to the isolationist impulses of certain parts of the American public. That's very different than 1991, when everybody thought we had won in 1991, liberal international democracy would have spread and flourished. I think we have doubts about that here now. Certain parts of the segments of the American public too. The Russians see that, and that for them is an opportunity to exploit. It's a division within the society that they can exploit to their advantage.
Thank you.
Yeah, just one big point. I think the biggest indicator coming down the pike regarding Trump's relationship with Putin, his approach with Putin, is going to be this Friday when Zelensky comes to Washington. This is a really interesting visit for me because there's been no real build-up to it. It was originally just his prime minister who's coming into town to work on the economic side of the relationship. All of a sudden, boom, after two conversations, Saturday and Sunday, Zelensky's gonna get on a plane and truck over to Washington. Why would Trump do that? That is such a stark contrast to what we saw, February, with the blow up. So I'm wondering if something's going on, because on the agenda is, of course, tomahawks. I'm not sure if Trump's going to do that, but there's also, the big drone deal and other things. There's growing frustration in the administration over Trump's recalcitrance, his refusal to move forward to a ceasefire. So this visit that's coming on Friday to me is kind of important, because Trump doesn't just like to do visits for the heck of it. He likes to do visits for big things. So I'm holding my breath for Friday. This could be really interesting.
You heard it here first.
5 days.
Other question? Yes.
Pardon me, Ambassador Gilmore actually has a question that I'm going to ask
Oh,
in
great.
chat, and then we will go straight to you.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
What do you think about the Trump pro-Putin policy of trying to leverage Russia against China? Is this why Trump buddies up to Putin? Does this explain the terrible conduct of Elbridge Colby at Defense?
Well, pick it was. Next question. We can pass on this question if you want to.
No, I think you should.
Okay, but,
I think there are some in the administration that think you can kind of do a reverse China. Make some reverse China, instead of pulling China away from the Soviet Union, pull Russia away from China. I think it's a naive belief policy, if that's in fact what they're trying to do. Because one, it assumes you can develop a trustful, reliable relationship with Putin, that he'll actually give up his ambitions. I think that would be naive. Second, it underestimates how dependent Russia is on China today. I mean, Russia would not be able to sustain its war against Ukraine. It would not be able to sustain its aggression against the West if China weren't basically bankrolled. And Putin knows that. So he's not going to give up his relationship with China, because what is he going to get in return? He's going to get in return the surrendering of his ambitions regarding Ukraine, NATO, and perhaps other territories of the former Soviet states. And as for Bridge Colby, Bridge Colby is, I think, and he's a good friend of mine, and he's a very smart guy, so I listen to what he has to say. I don't agree with what he has to say. But when it comes down to how happy he's going to be in the policymaking process, well, we'll see in the coming weeks when they roll out the national security strategy, national defense strategy, and ultimately the global posture field. All of which will probably come out at the end of October, November. I say end of October because we have the defense ministerial in NATO in mid-October. They're going to roll out bad news. Why do it before the ministerial? You do it afterwards. But I think Bridge is going to be frustrated because I'm expecting a set of documents that aren't going to shift America's posture and emphasis to the Indo-Pacific. It's not going to probably be headed to reanimating our interest in Europe, but it's going to do something opposite. It's going to reanimate our focus, or animate our focus on the Western Hemisphere and Homeland Defense, which means forces from Europe, forces from the Indo-Pacific coming home, not going over to to Bridges' priority, which is protecting Taiwan and American interests in the Indo-Pacific. So he may be in for a phase of frustration, but we'll see.
You're predicting a hot war with Venezuela? Is that what you say? We got time for one more short question and a short answer.
Obviously, you kind of answered part of my question, and that is, to what extent is Putin dependent upon resources from China, North Korea, Iran, India, and others to continue his war? And is the U.S. doing everything it can to leverage those opportunities to reduce that dependence, reduce that inflow of revenue and technology from those countries?
I think Ambassador Dugan has one question too.
Okay, we can. Second question is on.
Well, mine is perhaps directed mostly at Dr. Jensen, because I noticed you were with Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. And I guess I would like to, and I must disclose, I spent a lot of my childhood in the developing world, and I found those broadcasts, and a lot of people still listen to the radio. So I guess I'd like your comments about the impact on the Soviet Union and any thoughts on where we go from here.
In 1 minute, this is the impact of Radio for Europe and the Voice of America.
But I mean, where do we go from
Where are we going with that?
Cuts or the impact being cuts or
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
The impact, you asked the question, what do you think? What if you think the impact of the cut?
Yeah, I mean, do we still have influence internationally through our international broadcasts? And are there other media taking its place, and what the heck's going on?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it made an amazing difference to help end the Cold War. I lived in that lovely city of Prague for a long time. People never quite forgot the impact that, I still say we, as for 20 years, had. This gets back to the issue where it is soft power important, and I very much think that it is. I had a friend in Prague who was from Bulgaria, and he has a student who said in Sofia, he would always go to the American Embassy movies on Friday to watch American culture against soft power. And every time they opened the refrigerator on a Hollywood movie, there was always food in it. And he said, wow, I want to live in a country like that. But this is important, and I think that I very strongly, no one's asked me, support the rebuilding of those two institutions, really to some of their former vigor, and even especially in Russia now, when you're talking about dealing with the opposition that Ian and I mentioned, it's very, very important that these concerns, these voices, be heard and addressed in a direct way, because even the Russians, as unanimously as they seem to be in favor of Putin, which is not true, they value that very highly. It's really a small bang for the buck, and I think well worth it. So let's hope they can advise those countries. The BBC is still pretty active. Deutsche Welle, some of the other broadcasters, but RFE in particular had a symbol, a status of liberation from communism that I think has lessons for us today. And it was really a privilege to work there. I would add that when I got there, we had moved from Munich to Prague. We also started to go into FM and then abandoning shortwave, but also social media now is very, very important. And if you're attentive to those technological developments, I think it really does make a difference. The RFE profile when I was there was 5% of the target audience, which is about what NPR got. And it's the educated change makers, influencers that really can listen and know that someone out there agrees with them and is proposing productive, constructive ways to go ahead. So I think it's very important.
And the last question was, Ambassador Bliss's question is, are we doing enough to get China, India, and others who are propping up Russia to not do it? Any thoughts on that? Ian?
Sure, no. I mean, we're not. I mean, we've had incremental sanctions imposed over the last 3 or 4 years on Russia. We're not body slamming the Russian economy. We're not body slamming economically China, North Korea, Iran, the way we body slammed the Iranian economy. But what we really did shut down, shut it down. We had to go to secondary sanctions. Our problem is that we don't want the blowback. We're politically timid. We don't have the political will. We don't have a president. And this is a bipartisan statement. This is true with Biden, this is true with Trump. When it goes to the American people, we need to ruffle sleeves and endure a little pain for the greater good of mankind, for our transatlantic interests, for our own. And then if I had one last wish I would make on strategic communications, the dumbest thing that I've ever been associated with was the shutting down of USIA back in 1998. That was an exercise in self-kneecapping. We're paying the price today. You know, in 1998, I think USIA was $3 billion. That was basically the umbrella of strategic communications. That organization should be reanimated. It should be restructured for the communications technologies of today, social media, internet, and all that sort of thing. But that is a critical missing element of our arsenal to be competitive, not against Russia, but against all the challenges we face globally from an increasingly complex and diversified array of actors. It's a missed opportunity to shape the world in a way that will benefit us ideologically, militarily, and economically. We should reanimate this organization.
On that assertive and optimistic note, let's give a round of applause to our panel.